Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us today. I'm sure all of us have just had a good lunch, so I'll try to make this talk as exciting and as interesting as possible. Please bear with me for the next hour or so. Now, all of us want to do good. At least that's what I hope and I believe that all of us here, coming from a health and social sector, all of us that's joining in this NVPC talk, all of us really come from a good place and we really want to impact the community that we serve. But however, sometimes we try to do our best, but somehow we just don't seem to get it right. I'm not sure if you had such situations before, but I certainly have had. So maybe just to look at some of the services that we have here in Singapore that perhaps came from a good place, but didn't quite meet some of the objectives, right? So back when several years ago, when I was still working for a healthcare service, I used to volunteer my time every year without fail to service single room flats where seniors were living alone. And in these situations, a scene like this is something that we see quite typically, where we find that there is lots of food that was given out by different social agencies and services, and there's so much of it over there. So, coming from a hospital, these seniors were actually identified by our social workers. They perhaps came in through our healthcare service because of an acute episode. And many a times, these seniors suffer from multiple comorbidities, meaning that they might have hypertension, they might have diabetes, with other confounding symptoms and conditions as well. What we see when we visited these homes, when we look at the food that was given out, a lot of them are sugar laden food that perhaps are not so suitable for diabetic patients, or really instant noodles that are salty that perhaps are not meant for someone that is suffering from hypertension. So perhaps something here was amiss, and how might we then design better services to look after these senior that are isolated? So what might have caused this perhaps was due to errors in the way that we perceive the challenges, right? So often when we approach a problem, we approach it from our own or organization lens. With a limited amount of information, we might have led to designing and implementing a service that is generalized. Sometimes it might be due to availability of needs. We perhaps have been running a same service somewhere else in Singapore, say in Boon Lay, but now we would like to implement this in somewhere in Ang Mo Kio, for example. We might want to be wary that the population that we're serving is different, and their needs are different. The demographics is different. In fact, from person to person, the needs are different. We might also come from an organization perspective that, because of economics of scale, it makes sense for us to run this way because it's just simpler and easier to implement. If you're coming from that angle, then I really hope to err the caution of, are we doing good for the people that we serve? Might we run into issues if we continue to do things this way? Ultimately, the people that are in such a situation, perhaps they are trying to get out of poverty, for example, but yet at the same time, they are having diets that are perhaps not so suitable for them. In the end, what might happen is that a social problem might then become a health problem, right? And similarly, health problems will then cause other social problems. They're really two sides of the coin. So we do have to be careful about that. Uh, Several years ago, I was in conversation with people that were working for the Methodist Welfare Service, and they run a house for the rough sleepers. So we're just curious and we're having a chat and was asking them, so what are these profiles of these people that we're trying to serve, and what were the challenges that they had? So For example, they are looking at targeting those that are just started to become rough sleepers. They find that those are the ones that perhaps were easier to help them get out of the situation. But there are also those that have been sleeping in the rough for years right now. And when you speak with them, sometimes this is the narrative that you might hear, that they might tell you that, hey, you know what? I really don't want your money, and I don't really need you to pity me. So with that conversation, then we dive a little bit deeper, and it really reminded me of some psychological principles, right? That exist. For example, the reciprocity principle, right? The behavioral tendency for us to reciprocate something positive with something positive as well. Uh, so this kind of a behavior allows us to form networks between communities, allow us to build interdependence. However, if we are unable to reciprocate something good that somebody has done for us, that may in the end result as a form of stress as well. So in this case, some of these rough sleepers, they may be suffering the burden of reciprocity, right? So they are unable to reciprocate the same good things that people are doing for them, and therefore perhaps they then would then seek to be more isolated. So when we're designing for services, we have to be cognizant of such emotional needs of people. So then I guess begs the question on then how might we design services that are more impactful from that angle. So from that front, then one way to look at it would be who defines value, right? So value for services that we run sometimes is perceived from the angle of the service provider. And in that case, we have defined our service and our offerings based on our own understanding, based on what we think our beneficiaries need. And that might then run us into different problems that we might see. Just would like to touch a little bit more on services as well. The difference between services and designing of services and designing of products, right? So they are quite different in the way that how a value is being created and how value is being delivered. For example, a car, right? When I buy the raw materials for a car, there is certainly some value to the raw materials. When I produce a car, when I build the car, then definitely I'm more willing to pay for car than as opposed to the raw materials. When it's being distributed into my neighborhood, right, being sold in Singapore, yes, I'll perhaps will pay a bit more for that. But what happens once you buy a car? You can't sell it for the same price ever again, can you? Right. So the price or the value of a product depreciates over time, or at least that is the majority of the trends of products. Value behaves that way. However, when it comes down to services, if you think about in comparison, if you talk about transportation, if you think about Grab, for example, when I produce an app, I launch it in an app store, I download it in my phone. Is it really doing anything for me? Not really, right? The only time where the Grab app would be of any value to me is when I need to get from A to B, when I turn on my phone, when I log into that app, when I book for a ride, when I enter the car, I'm getting from A to B. And this is when I'm actually receiving value. So what I'm trying to say here for services, value is something that is created upon transaction when someone is interacting with that service, and that is where value exists. And as soon as the passenger steps out of the Grab car and goes back to the daily life, that value that your service brings dissipates and disappears into thin air once again. So there's a little bit of a difference over here. And with regard to this, then how do we then design better services? So I guess then would then to be recognizing that services have a very different kind of characteristics in value creation. And with that, then what is the roles of different things that we create in order to support a service, right? So in terms of a good, something that's tangible, in terms of a normal product, the product itself is a value. a watch in itself, it's the value. But when we're looking at a service, for example, there's something that's on an app, for example, the mobile phone is just a means towards delivering that value. It's not the value in itself. And in terms of value creation, the products, when we create that products, we create that value, right? But in terms of value creation in a service, that is something that is done at a point of service delivery, at a point of service interaction with our service users. And with that, then begs a different attitude that we must have when we are approaching our users. In the past, we approach users as if they hold a problem that we want to solve. You need to tell time, I design a watch for you. You need to get from A to B, we'll design a car for you. But in this case, when we talk about services, then really we should be treating them as perhaps beneficiaries and a solution holder themselves, because they are integral part of that value creation, right? And so with that, then perhaps users are not just passive recipients of value, but rather they are co-producers of value, right? If they are co-producers of value, then shouldn't we then involve them in the design process on how that value is being created? So what I'm saying for all these is that what I'm trying to say is that for services, when you're trying to design services, we really have to approach it from a collaborative point of view, to allow the power of creating this service to be diffused and shared with our service users, to invite our patients or to invite our service recipients and beneficiaries to the session to sit down together with us and co-design this service together. And how might we do that? So one way to do this is by using design thinking, right? So design thinking is an approach that allows us or any people, right, to practice the way that designers approach designing solutions, right? So no matter what designer you are, if you're a furniture designer or you're a UX designer or a service designer, all of us go through a similar thinking trajectory. We start by trying to understand what the user needs, reframing it, ideating, prototyping, and testing. So I would like to go a little bit deeper into these different domains. Right. So for first domain, the first phase that you go through would be empathy, right? So what we're trying to practice at this point, the mindset that I hope that all of us can inculcate at this point, at the start of our journey, is to put aside our assumptions, to leave aside what we know, and try to connect ourselves with our users and immerse in their needs. So this is a process of to be human-centered, right? To put our service recipients at the center of our entire design process, to involve them in the work that we do. And being empathetic is not only towards our service users, but also to the multiple stakeholders that are going to run this service as well. So we want to have a holistic lens that will be able to allow us to transit between different lenses from different point of views to understand how might we design a win-win solution between the service provider, the different stakeholders in the community, and as well as our users. In the next phase, when we enter define, so now that we have understood a little bit better the point of view of our service recipients, what their needs are, and as well as the needs of our different stakeholders in the community, then it's about sitting down and analyzing what we have understood and reframing our understanding of the challenge from the perspective of our users and the various stakeholders. This might be an iterative process. So by reframing this doesn't mean that we are stuck with this one frame of challenge that we want to solve. As we go along the process, as we speak to more and more people, we might then understand new perspective. And we would like to bring that new perspective in and reiterate our understanding and redefine what the challenge that we'd like to solve. By doing this, we are then truly driven by the impact that we want to deliver, right? So focusing on the impact that we want to create. After which, once we have defined what is this challenge that is worth working on, that is of value from the user's perspective, that is something that perhaps would motivate them, that's something that they want to use and reap, then it's about then stepping out of the box to think about ideas and concepts from multiple angles. So one way that we can do this is I would generally encourage people to be visual in this process of creating ideas and sharing of ideas, especially when it comes down to services. Many a times when designing services, what we're really designing is an experience. An experience is something that is intangible. And if you want to describe it in words, you will take forever. And in fact, you might write an entire thesis and you still might not be able to verbalize or write down what this experience is all about. But if you're being able to be visual or to create something that people will be able to experience for themselves, then that's a good way that we can communicate our ideas, and a good way to ideate as well when we step out of our usual way of thinking and thinking from a visual perspective. And in ideation, we also would like to remind people that it's really a collaborative process and not something that is done by an expert, right? We would like to invite our service users, service recipients to come in to co-design together, to co-ideate what is this service that you want to see. So the whole part about collaborative is about being open-minded to possibilities, to work with diverse teams and diverse perspectives, to leverage on one another's strengths, to bring to the table to design something that's beneficial for all parties. In design, we emphasize a lot on prototyping because we want to create an experience, we want to create a product. What better than to make something that is tangible, that people can see and feel and understand. And with that, what allows us to do with a prototype is to be experimental, right? So once we have created some form of a prototype, we want to walk out of the door and test this with people, test this with users. And with that real world feedback, then that will allow us to reshape our solutions and design a better product. We also encourage people to be biased for action at this point. Once you have an idea, don't be afraid to just walk out the door and get somebody in to comment and feedback, right? So that's the only way that we can improve. So with that, I would like to just remind people to not fall in love with your ideas. Many a times we grow a strong attachment to an idea that we think that is impactful, that we love so much about it. But what we really want to do is to put this to the test, right? To bring the prototype out and test it in a real world setting. Will people want to use something that's like this? And to be open-minded and take in what people are saying as design insights for us to then reshape what we have created. So testing or design critique, right, is something that is important for us to design better services. With that, then it's back to iteration, right? So once you've understood what the users are saying when we bring out a prototype to test it, then it's about iterating and having the mindset that we never fail, but we just learn more about what people needs really are and what their motivations really are. So with this iteration and with the commitment to impact, then that's how we might be able to create something that's impactful for our service recipients. And so if you put all these and weave it together into a single process, then that's what we will see, right? So we go through the phase of empathy to understand our users' needs a little bit better, to redefine the needs and the challenge that we're working on. And then we'll test our definition, for example. So we'll go out there, we'll conduct a focus group, get people together or interview different stakeholders and test, have we gotten what you need exactly? Have we already understood what you want? With that understanding, then we go out to ideate, prototype, and go back to testing again. So you can see that this entire process is an iterative one. And that in fact, in ideation, nothing is really stopping us to go out and practice empathy and redefine and come back again. So it's not really a linear process. And throughout this entire process, we also encourage people to practice divergent and convergent thinking. So what do I mean by that would be in phases of, say, for example, empathy and ideation, we really want you to go out there and understand as much as possible about our users, or ideate as much ideas as possible, so to be as divergent as you can, right? And in different phases, when you are coming down to define, what is that exact one problem that's really worth solving, that we should prioritize, then that's about convergence, right? When we're testing, there's also a convergent process. When we prototype it, when we bring it out there and get people tested, then we will be able to understand which are the features that people value and which were the ones that we should prioritize in our development. So that would be the conversion process that you would be going through in design thinking. If you apply this back to the two problems that I initially raised, right? So this really helped us to solve human-centered challenges, right? To allow us to design services from the lens of our service recipients by firstly empathizing with their needs, their emotional needs, or their physical or health needs, to redefine the challenge from the service recipient's perspective. So what would seniors want to receive? Something that's healthy for them, something that is more meant for the condition that they face. To co-design the service together with the service recipients. So in the case of the RAF sleepers, are we able to get them in to design, how do we communicate better with RAF sleepers such that we do not touch on some of their rough spots, and allow them to see that, hey, perhaps there's other things that you can contribute to in the center that we have, such that you will be able to feel that this place is also part of yours. They are something that you'll be able to reciprocate in a way. And to improve through testing, iteration, and shaping the service based on real-world feedbacks from the seniors and from the RAF sleepers. I think that would be great. And to design a service with stakeholders, to include them as part of the whole process, right? So with that, then we might be able to then go towards something that I understand that this is something that's practiced more in the service sector, looking at asset-based community development. So how might we leverage on different assets that a community has in order for it to support itself, right? So if we are able to engage and understand the problems from our users' lens, and that is then where we might be able to work with them to co-develop and co-design something that bring the assets of the community in and design something that is sustainable for the community. Right. So with that, that might perhaps solve some of the problems. In the recent talk that Minister Desmond Lee gave at the Social Service Summit, he mentioned that there are still families out there that continue to struggle because they face complex web of interlocking challenges that complicate one another, that no one agency would be able to solve on their own. So with that, then is designs will be able to help in designing for complexity such as these. I would like to argue yes, and would like to share a case study where something like that was done, right? So we'd like to share a case study that is done in Australia. This is done in Sydney by Dr. Micah and team, where they were approached by a non-profit organization to design for better urgent response for people suffering from persistent and severe mental health challenges. For example, these people could be suffering from repeated psychotic episodes. They might have repeated acute anxiety or suicidal thoughts. And how might we then design for a better urgent response? The problem that they had then was that these urgent response often involved a lot of different people, and all of these people may not be trained in how to deal with mental health. And at the same time, needs of individuals for in this case is quite specific and it's not general, right? So how do we then design for that? So what the team did was they went out, they had focus groups with all the different stakeholders. So from the paramedics that goes out for the emergency response, the police in the community, landlords, because sometimes they are the ones who call up for the help. social service organizations that are also in the community that are serving these people. Sometimes they are the first responders, and as well as carers and patients themselves, right? So from this, what they really understood was that for sure some of the general themes that emerged were, all of them want to make a difference, right? I think that is nothing surprising. All of us from health and social care, that's why we exist and that's why we do what we do, right? So the ambulance paramedic mentioned that, hey, there's no better feeling than saving someone's lives, right? But when they peel a bit deeper, then they then understood what actually drives and feeds this motivation was being able to receive a feedback that this patient gotten better, or this resident is now managing better, or there's a better way to manage this resident now. And with that, then they're able to learn and grow and deliver better service to these people, right? So one of the police officers mentioned that if we do not hear from the person again, there is a general assumption that three things might have happened. One, they gotten better. Two, they moved away. Three, they passed. We are essentially feeding our efforts into a cone of silence that gives us no response, right? So we realize that there is a pattern over here for the service providers in this case that, yes, they act out of that motivation to do good. At the same time, they need that kind of feedback in order to have the sense of achievement, in order to understand what actually happened so that they might then grow and to improve their practice. Understanding these themes allowed the design team to then take this back and look beyond the context of this problem, to look at theme of having drive and having growth. How is this being managed in other settings? This being Australia, they have a local emergency management committee that responds to floods and to bushfires, right? So they look at what these teams are doing. So every year they will sit down in a committee, they'll plan out what is the emergency response that they will roll out. And they will then, if something does happen, if the bushfire does happen, they will definitely act, right? And after that, at the end, they will come back again, they'll review how else might we do better? How can we react faster? How might we help the residents in the area such that they are not so worried how to prevent or to react better, right? Another slant that they took was to take note of sports teams. How did sports teams actually manage drive and growth? They realized that for sports teams, for example, soccer, right? There's the coach that's at the side of the field that's observing or maybe even video recording what the players are doing. And with this evidence, they will then be able to take it back to the sports team and coach them to say that, hey, this is how you can do in order to perhaps collaborate better or perhaps to improve what you're doing. With that, they came up with an idea of a cross-organizational coaching team where they have to invite people in or to curate past experiences of such mental health episodes, curate them into narratives and stories. And with that, they invited leaders from all these different groups in. So leaders from the police force, the hospital, the ambulance teams, the social workers, and all of them to come in and form a cross-organizational coaching team where they will review these contents on how were the past emergency responses being done. With that, then they're able to better coach their own people on how to do better. So essentially, it's a live mechanism, right? So that every time something happens, they will try to understand what happens. They'll take that back as evidence. And with that, it becomes a way for them to coach and better progress together. So what we're saying here is that for complex problems, then perhaps it's not so much about designing for a single touch point or designing for something that is very static, such as a SOP or a protocol. For example, a call operator. So that might be a simpler situation where you receive a call and the call may have certain permutations of inquiries and probabilities of the questions that they might ask. So I can prepare that in an SOP. But however, in an emergency response, the permutation is unable to be controlled, right? So then how we deal with that is perhaps then is designing for social infrastructures rather than designing for something that's static. Second is also to realize that health and social care is really truly delivered by professionals, right? All of us are professionals in our own right. May you be a therapist, a social worker, a nurse, all of us are professionals. So how might we then design something that allow professionals to bring in their own practice and consciously change and shape the way things are done? Right. So that can only be done if we're then designing for interactions between different professionals rather than actions and controlling the actions that they take. And with this kind of format of design, for design for social infrastructure, we are also then allowing change to happen from within. The team will then learn how to do better over time, as opposed to something that is locked and fixed in time that needs to be reviewed from time to time. Right. So with that, just would like to recap on design thinking a little bit. So some of us think that design thinking is an approach. Well, that's not wrong, right? So design thinking is an approach that towards solving problems. And with our approach, there are different processes that we do, the different tools that we apply, there are different methods that we adopt. But more importantly, design thinking, as the name of it would allude to, it is a way of thinking. It's a mindset that we want to have. And if you have this mindset with you, you have won half the battle, right? So again, just to recap a little bit, right? So to design for more impactful services, we might first want to connect with the people that we are serving, to empathize what their needs are, to redefine the problems from their lens and from the lens of the stakeholders, to test our understanding of what we have defined, and from there, go through a process of ideating, prototyping, and testing until arrive at something that is impactful for our community. If you're interested to find out a bit more, NUS-ISS Smart Health Leadership Center, we have collaborated with NCSS in producing the Social Innovation Starter Kit. That's something that you can download and read a little bit more about how you might use design to design for social innovation. So if you'd like to have a copy, just scan a QR code, and I think it will bring you to NCSS website where you can download a digital copy of this starter kit. And with that, that ends my little sharing, and hope that there's any questions that you might have that might be able to answer. And right, so there's a question on, we see the benefits of design-centric services. Why do you think we are not seeing more of this in our healthcare setting? Well, I think there's multiple different approach thinking of this, right? So, I used to come from a healthcare setting, and the old way of thinking was to apply concepts such as Lean and Six Sigma to improve service delivery. There's nothing wrong with that approach, but we think that that approach is more meant for things that are such as weight, such as time, right? Such as logistics or delivery of things. It works better in those realms where we're improving processes from that standpoint. We really need to transit beyond that and move towards a more of a human-centered approach, to think from our patient's perspective and designing from their angle. Why do we not see that? I guess it just takes time for us to adopt a new way of doing things. Sometimes, if you think about it, it's also a way that healthcare professionals protect ourselves. We sometimes distance away from the emotions that are there in health and social care. Sometimes, it's such an emotional weight for our nurses, for our doctors, that sometimes we distance away from the real problems that people are facing that do not allow us to fully then in future empathize with their needs. So definitely it's not easy because health and social care sometimes are tackling problems where people are pushed to the brink, right? So yeah, but I do believe that in time we can do more and to preach more of human-centered design within health and social care. Yeah. It's not that it's something that's non-existent. I think that it has been something that has been going on for some time. I started my journey in looking into design for health and social care about 10 years ago now. And 10 years ago, back then, I wasn't the first person that's doing this. For example, Changi has already done bring in such concepts to, for example, redesign one of their orthopedics clinic. So if you visit the orthopedics clinic in Changi General Hospital, you'll realize that a lot of well-designed features within that clinic, for example, foldable chairs that allows caregivers to sit beside their next of kin that might be coming in on a wheelchair, for example. So yes, so there has been some of that done much early on, more than 10 years ago. Yeah. Is there any other questions? So how do we comprehensively measure, identify, and effectiveness of your design thinking initiatives? Impact measurement, I think, definitely is something that's very important. If you do not know what's the impact, then how do we know that if we have done something right? However, we also want to be careful not to encroach with too much KPIs right at the start. So for design process to be effective, I will not recommend KPIs to be defined right from the get-go, but rather something that is then introduced later on as we are iterating through prototyping and testing. And that's where it's a good time to come up with your theory of change, to come up with different measures of how do we define impact. Are we really doing something good for the community? I think that can take place. But if you're in an early stage where you still in a hazy state of not really sure what the problems really are, then defining KPIs or defining measures too early might artificially nudge us towards convergence way too early. And with convergence at the start, then prevents us from coming up with interesting or novel solutions. So something to be mindful of. But yes, I do think that measures are important. Once we transit into that prototyping and testing iteration phase, then it's a good time to come up with a theory of change, to understand how do we actually affect, what is the behaviors that we want to effect, and then from there define some of the measures that we might be able to identify and quantify these impacts from there. Yeah. All right. Waiting for a few more questions. I hope there are more. If not, then I call it a day. So personally, I find that for designing for health and social services, maybe another barrier would be the complexity that we're dealing with. And it's not so much about designing rigid processes, I would think. It's perhaps more about what I shared about in the case study, where we might want to design for social infrastructure that then allow our professionals to act upon that and to learn and to improve. So something that is a bit more different and a bit more difficult to wrap our minds around sometimes. So I think that might be also another barrier, the complexity that we deal with in health and social care. What may be the best way to encourage stakeholders to learn how to empathize with patients? I do actually think that because we are working with patients day in and day out every day, we do understand a big part of their problem. But it is important for us to recognize that we ourselves are not our patients, that we ourselves are not living in the same context, not living with the same conditions that they are having. And to recognize the fact that they are indeed the expert of their own lives and they are the expert of their own situation, right? So we really need to consult them from that angle. One way to get people to empathize with the challenge that you're having, then that perhaps goes into more about the way that we're able to convey why should we be working on this problem. So identifying that why and trying to find perhaps a user story, a patient story that would be able to bring this element out and communicate that to the different stakeholders that we have to say that, hey, this kind of patients exist and they are facing these challenges, and have the patient to share their own stories. I think more oftentimes than not, us, because we come from a good place and we want to effect change for our patients, most clinicians would be happy to come on board, I feel. Yep. Any suggestions on how design thinking can be implemented at a care level by those at the front lines, whether health and social care? More often than not, frontline workers are constrained by SOPs on what they can or cannot be done. Um, yes, I think we're treading some thin lines sometimes. The SOPs exist for a reason. SOP exists because we want to protect our patients, right? We want to ensure a certain level of care, and we want to ensure a consistent provision of care. I would think that for one is to recognize what is the meaning of these SOPs and why they exist. And if we understand where these SOPs come from, then we can always design solutions that would then take these into account as well, and not so much about going around them. Of course, sometimes some policies may have been designed a long time ago, and then those might need to be reviewed. I would also think that if you keep that different design phases and the design key principles in mind, so being experimental, being bias for action, to empathize and understand before you act, to define the problems from your patient's point of view or from your service recipient's point of view, then you will be able to do a good job, do practice design on your own on the ground, no matter how big or small the initiative that you're driving is. Yeah, so I don't think it's a big challenge for people to just adopt some of these mindsets and just applying that to what they do. Yeah. Okay, great. I think time's up. So thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you have taken something away for you within this short 1 hour. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the symposium.